The words hit Esther Sutton like a fist to the sternum. "I saved a place for you." She stood in the doorway of the Maddox ranch house, her travel-worn boots still caked with the red clay of the trail, her carpetbag hanging from fingers gone suddenly numb. Milton Maddox was across the room, standing beside the fireplace with his hat in his hands, turning the brim in slow, deliberate circles, the way a man does when he is trying very hard not to fall apart. The fire threw amber light across the sharp planes of his face, across the jaw she had once memorized with her fingertips, and she could not breathe. "How long?" she asked because she had to ask, because something in the gravity of his voice told her the answer was going to cost her everything she had been telling herself for the past several months. He looked up. Those gray eyes found hers across the dusty floorboards and the 4 feet of air between them that felt like a canyon. "Since last winter," he said. The words cracked through her chest like a rifle shot on a cold morning. Last winter. Last winter, when she had packed her trunk and climbed aboard the stagecoach in Abilene and told herself he would not notice. Last winter, when she had convinced herself that Milton Maddox was a man who filled spaces and then abandoned them, the way the wind fills a valley and moves on without apology. Last winter, when she had fled from the one thing in this territory that had ever made her feel like something more than a woman running from her own dark past. He had saved a place for her. He had been saving it since last winter. And the most devastating, the most beautiful, the most utterly ruinous part of it was this: she had known he would. She had run precisely because she had known. The fire popped. Outside, the wind moved through the tall grasses of the Kansas plain with a sound like the whole world sighing. Esther Sutton set her carpetbag down on the floorboards very carefully, as though it contained something fragile, and she stood up straight, and she looked at Milton Maddox, and she said the only true thing she had in her. "I should not have come back." "But you did," he said. "That doesn't mean I was right to." "No," he agreed, "but you're here." And the whole terrible weight of last winter, and the winter before that, and every secret she had been carrying since she first set foot in Hays City, Kansas, in the autumn of 1878, came rushing down on her all at once. This is where it had all begun. Esther had arrived in Hays City on the 3rd of October, 1878, on the back of a wagon belonging to a freighter named Gus Tolliver, who owed a favor to her aunt in St. Louis. She was 23 years old, possessed of a small trunk of practical clothing, $47.16, a letter of introduction to the proprietress of a boarding house on the main street, and a secret that she carried the way some people carry an old wound, quietly, constantly, and with the perpetual low-grade fear that someone would press on it and make it bleed. She was not running from the law precisely, but she was running from something that lived in the same dark neighborhood as the law. Her name in St. Louis had not been Sutton. Her name in St. Louis had been Esther Vane, and Esther Vane had made the grave mistake of being in love with a man named Clement Vane, her husband of 18 months, who had turned out to be a confidence man of the highest order, the kind of man who could smile at you over the breakfast table and simultaneously be defrauding a dozen families of their savings. When the federal marshals came, Clement had run. He had been a coward in the end, which should not have surprised her but did, because she had believed in him absolutely and completely. She had not been charged with anything. There was no evidence that she had known, but the people of St. Louis had looked at her the way people look at the wives of disgraced men, with that particular blend of pity and suspicion that is somehow worse than accusation, because it never fully resolves into anything you can argue against. So she had changed her name back to her maiden name, Sutton, and she had taken Gus Tolliver's wagon west, and she had arrived in Hays City with her $47 and her secrets and her iron determination to become someone new. Mrs. Cecilia Hartwell ran the boarding house on Delaware Street, and she was a broad, brisk woman of 50 who asked very few questions and expected very clean floors. She gave Esther a room on the 2nd floor, a narrow bed, a window that looked out over the dusty Main Street, and the immediate understanding that her keep would be earned by helping with the cooking and the laundry. Esther was grateful. Work was something she understood. Work was something that kept her hands busy and her mind from the particular kind of spiraling that happened when she lay still in the dark. She had been in Hayes City for 3 weeks before she met Milton Maddox. It was at the Mercantile on a Monday morning. She had gone to purchase thread and a small sack of cornmeal for Mrs. Hartwell, and he had been there arguing with old Pete Reardon about the price of fence wire in a low, patient voice that managed to convey absolute certainty without ever raising above a conversational level. She had noticed him the way you notice a boulder in a river, not because it is beautiful, though it was in its way, but because it is simply there in a way that everything else moves around. He was tall, broad through the shoulder, with the kind of weathered face that belonged to a man who had spent the better part of his 30 years working outdoor land in all seasons. He had dark brown hair that needed cutting and those gray eyes that caught the light in the Mercantile window and held it a beat longer than seemed natural. He was not a handsome man in any decorative sense. He was a man who looked like the land he worked, spare and honest and shaped by forces that did not care for ornamentation. He had turned from his argument with Pete Reardon and nearly walked directly into her. She stepped aside. He stepped the same direction. They both stopped. "Beg your pardon," he said. His voice was the same low, certain register as when he had been arguing about fence wire, and she found herself thinking that it was likely the same voice he used for everything, for bargaining, for apologizing, for whatever else he needed to say. A man without separate registers for separate occasions. "My fault," she said, because she had been standing in the middle of the aisle. He had looked at her the way someone looks at a thing they are trying to understand and said, "You are new." It was not a question and it was not a greeting precisely. It was a statement of observed fact delivered without judgment. "I am," she said. "Milton Maddox," he said, and extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief and not performative. "Esther Sutton," she said. Something in his face shifted the way a landscape shifts when a cloud moves off the sun, subtly but completely. He nodded once as though she had confirmed something he had been half expecting, and then he stepped aside to let her pass, and she went to find her thread. She thought about that look for days afterward. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself a great many things in those first months that turned out to be wrong. The social geography of Hayes City was not complicated, as small western towns went. There was the cattle trade, which ruled the economy and the calendar. There was the railroad, which had been there since 1867 and had brought everything else. There was a significant population of cowboys, teamsters, merchants, and the various service workers who orbit any frontier economy, including the women of the line who worked at the establishments on the east end of town, whom Esther noted and did not judge, because she understood enough about the desperation that brought a woman to a place like that. There was a sheriff named Harlan Cobb, who was competent and largely fair. And there were a handful of established families who owned land and ran cattle, and represented the beginnings of the kind of settled respectability that would eventually smooth over everything the frontier had been. The Maddox family was one of these. Milton's father, Samuel Maddox, had come to Kansas in 1872 with his wife, Clara, who had died of fever in 1875, and his son, who had been 17 then and had taken over most of the actual running of the ranch when Samuel's heart began to give him trouble 2 years later. The ranch was 3 miles south of town, 600 acres of grassland and a creek, modest by the standards of the big cattle operations, but solid, genuinely solid, the kind of place that had been made by consistent hard work rather than spectacular luck. Esther learned all of this from Mrs. Hartwell, who was a reliable source of local history and who had a particular warm regard for Milton Maddox, because he had fixed her roof the previous spring without being asked and without charging her for it. "He is a good man," Mrs. Hartwell told Esther over their first cup of morning coffee together, which happened about 2 weeks into Esther's residence when some unspoken mutual assessment was apparently satisfied. Not a showy man, not the kind of man who makes a woman feel giddy, but the kind of man who shows up, and I will take that every day of the week over giddy. Esther had said nothing, but she had felt something tighten in her chest that she recognized with alarm as agreement. The autumn progressed. Esther began to find her footing in Hayes City. She made herself useful to Mrs. Hartwell and, gradually, to a wider circle. She had always been capable with her hands and her mind, and it did not take long for people to discover this. She began helping the schoolteacher, a thin young man named Mr. Addison, with administrative tasks because his handwriting was execrable and his organizational instincts were non-existent. She was asked to help organize the church's autumn social, which she did efficiently and which brought her into contact with most of the respectable women in town. She was careful. She was pleasant. She was useful without being forward, and quiet without being cold, and she watched very carefully how people regarded her and adjusted accordingly. She saw Milton Maddox at the church social on the last Saturday of October. He was standing near the food table with a cup of punch. He did not appear to be drinking, talking to a rancher named Bill Ferris about something that required them both to look serious and nod a lot. He was wearing a clean shirt and his good hat, and he had clearly combed his hair, and the fact that she could tell the difference between his everyday appearance and his dressed-up appearance told her, with a slight internal alarm, that she had been paying more attention to him than she had realized. He caught her eye across the room and nodded, the same single brief nod he had given her in the mercantile. She nodded back and turned away and spent the next 20 minutes arranging and rearranging the dessert table with entirely unnecessary precision. The problem was not that she was attracted to him, though she was, in that aching, quiet way that was somehow more dangerous than the brighter, louder kind of attraction because it settled in and made itself at home. The problem was that she was attracted to him, and she was Esther Vane, who had briefly been Clement Vane's wife, and Clement Vane had been a fraud, and anyone who got close enough to the real version of her would eventually have to reckon with that. She had promised herself, on Gus Tolliver's wagon looking west at the flat horizon, that she would not do that to anyone again. The second time they really talked was in November, when her horse, which she had hired from the livery to take to the Hartwell property outside town, threw a shoe on the road, and she was standing beside it on the open prairie looking at the expiring afternoon light with very grim feelings about her situation when Milton Maddox came along in his wagon. He pulled up beside her without fanfare. "Shoe," he said. "Shoe," she confirmed. He climbed down, checked the horse's hoof with brisk efficiency, and said, "I can take you back to town." Horse can come along tied behind. She had not particularly wanted to accept help. She had been managing entirely on her own since leaving St. Louis, and she had found that managing on her own, while harder, was at least uncomplicated. But the light was genuinely dying, and the town was 3 miles back, and the temperature was dropping with the specific efficiency of Kansas evenings in November. "Thank you," she said. They drove back toward town in the near dark, and for a while neither of them spoke. The prairie was very quiet and very large around them, and the first stars were beginning to appear, and it would have been, in different circumstances, very beautiful. "Or not from here," he said eventually. It was not accusatory. It was the same quality as all his statements, observational and without edge. "St. Louis," she said. "What brought you west?" She had her answer prepared. She had prepared it on Gus Tolliver's wagon and refined it in the weeks since. "A need for something different," she said. St. Louis felt small. He considered this. People don't usually find Kansas larger than St. Louis. "Physically, perhaps not," she said. "In other ways." He glanced at her sideways, and she thought she saw something in his expression that recognized what she was not saying, that understood the shape of an incomplete answer, and was choosing to respect it rather than press on it. It was, she thought with sudden unexpected warmth, a remarkably kind thing to do. "Fair enough," he said, and they rode the rest of the way in a silence that had changed character entirely, become something easier and more voluntary, like a thing chosen rather than a thing fallen into. He helped her return the horse to the livery. He walked her to the door of the boarding house. He lifted his hat and said good evening, and she said good evening, and she went inside and stood in the dark hallway for a moment with her hand pressed flat against the wall and told herself very firmly that this was not happening. It happened anyway. Not quickly and not dramatically, and not in the way that stories usually tell it, with grand declarations and single perfect moments. It happened the way real things happen in the cold, honest light of actual life, slowly and sideways, and through 100 small accumulations. He came to the boarding house on a Thursday in late November and asked if she might like to see the ranch. He said it matter-of-factly, as though it were a practical suggestion, and she had agreed with equal practicality, and then spent the better part of the morning arguing with herself about whether agreeing had been wise. The ranch was beautiful in the spare, stripped-down way of winter preparation. The grasses had gone gold and brown. The creek ran clear and fast. The house was low and solid with a wide porch, and the barn was bigger than the house, which she found she liked, because it told you something honest about the man's priorities. Samuel Maddox was on the porch when they arrived, wrapped in a heavy coat despite the relative mildness of the day, a compact man with Milton's gray eyes and a persistent cough that he dismissed with a wave of his hand when she asked after his health. "Old machinery," he said cheerfully. "Needs maintenance. Don't let it concern you, Miss Sutton. Tell me about yourself." She told him the practiced version, and Samuel Maddox listened with the same quality of respectful attention as his son, and did not press on the incomplete parts, and she thought that perhaps this was simply how the Maddox men were, structurally incapable of the particular kind of social aggression that disguises itself as friendly curiosity. Milton showed her the ranch. He did it the way he did everything, without performance, pointing out what was simply there and letting her form her own impressions. The horses, the small herd of cattle they kept through the winter. The garden plot, dormant now, that had been Clara Maddox's project, and that Milton maintained because his father could not, because it hurt Samuel to look at it for too long. He said this last part quietly and simply, and without asking her to respond to it, and she had found herself thinking that she had never in her life met a man who was so efficient with emotional honesty, who could put a painful thing into a sentence without either dramatizing it or hiding from it. On the drive back to town, she said, "Your mother's garden, you keep it up yourself." "Every year," he said. "Does it help, keeping it going?" He thought about this with the thoroughness he applied to most things. "I don't know that it helps," he said, "but it seems like the right thing." She looked out at the prairie and thought about her mother's kitchen in Indiana, which she had not thought about in years, and said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say, and he seemed to understand this too. December came. The social calendar of Hayes City contracted around the cold and the Christmas preparations. Esther found herself in a rhythm with the town that felt, alarmingly, like belonging. She helped at the schoolhouse. She was a regular presence at Mrs. Hartwell's table and at the Sunday services. She and Sheriff Cobb had developed a cordial working relationship after she had helped him draft a letter to the county seat regarding a boundary dispute that required more elegant written language than the sheriff possessed. She realized one morning while looking out her window at the frost-stiffened street below, becoming a person with a place in the world. She was also falling in love with Milton Maddox, and she knew it the way you know when you have stepped in something you cannot easily get off your boot, with a mixture of resignation and alarm. He came to town twice a week through December. Each time he did, there was some occasion for them to talk. It was never arranged in any obvious way. It was as though the town itself conspired to put them in the same place at the same time: the mercantile, the church, the street outside Mrs. Hartwell's, and they would talk with the ease of people who have already moved past the effortful stage of conversation into the comfortable stage, where the silences are as easy as the words. He told her about growing up on the ranch, about the particular loneliness of the Kansas plains in winter and how it had shaped him toward self-sufficiency. He told her about the drives north before his father's health failed, the cattle drives up the Kishom Trail that were already becoming a thing of the past as the railroad pushed further west and the trail drives became less necessary. He told her about a winter 3 years back when a blizzard had kept him in the house for 6 days, and he had read every book on the property twice and then started writing in the margins of them. Not notes exactly, just responses, talking back to the authors which he seemed mildly embarrassed about. She told him about St. Louis, the real version in parts, the true geography of it, the river, the smell of it in summer. Her mother, who had been a practical woman with a gift for making things beautiful on very little money. Her father, who had died when she was 15 and left them not exactly poor but permanently careful. She did not tell him about Clement Vane. She told herself this was because it was not relevant. She told herself this for about 3 weeks before she admitted that it was the most relevant thing about her, and that she was not telling him because she was afraid, and that the specific shape of her fear was this. She was afraid he would look at her the way the people of St. Louis had looked at her, with that particular blend of pity and suspicion that had no clean resolution. On the Saturday before Christmas, he came to the boarding house in the evening, which he had not done before, and asked if she would like to walk. She put on her coat and they walked down Delaware Street, past the Mercantile and the saloon and the sheriff's office, and the cold was sharp and clean and the sky was enormous above them, crowded with stars in the way that only a flat country sky can be, with no mountains or forests to take a piece of it. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "I want to ask you to come to the Christmas gathering at the Ferris place next week, with me, not just as people who happen to be at the same place." She understood what he was saying. She understood the precision with which he had said it, making the distinction explicit because he was a man who believed in clarity and did not want to be mistaken. She should have told him then. She should have said, "Before you ask me anything, there is something you need to know about who I am." She should have named Clement Vane and the federal marshals and the looks of the St. Louis people and let him decide with full information. Instead, she said yes. The Christmas gathering at the Ferris place was the largest social event of the season, which meant approximately 40 people in a warm house with good food and a fiddle player in the corner. She wore the best dress she had brought from St. Louis, a dark green wool that had been adequate in Missouri and was luxurious in Kansas, and Mrs. Hartwell had helped her dress her hair and had looked at her with a knowing expression that Esther had chosen not to examine. Milton arrived at the boarding house to walk her over in a clean jacket and his good hat, and with the particular quality of deliberate composure that told her he was slightly nervous, and she found this so unexpectedly tender that she had to look away from him for a moment. The evening was everything it was supposed to be. They talked and ate and watched the fiddle player and stood near the fire with cups of hot cider, and she was aware the entire time of the way the room organized itself around the fact of them arriving together, the small social recalibration that happens when people adjust their understanding of who belongs to whom. She felt it as both warmth and weight. Warmth because it felt like being seen in a good light. Weight because she had not told him the truth. He walked her home through the cold afterward. At the door of the boarding house he stood with his hat in his hands and said, "I would like to call on you properly, with your permission." She looked at him in the dark and thought about Clement Vane, who had also been very clear about his intentions and had turned out to be a fraud. She thought about the difference between that and this, because they were not the same and she knew they were not the same, and the knowing made it worse, not better. "Milton," she said, "you're going to say something that will put a stop to this," he said, not bitterly, just observationally, the way he said most things. "I have to tell you something first," she said. And she told him about Clement Vane. She told him the whole of it, standing in the cold outside Mrs. Hartwell's boarding house with the stars wheeling overhead and the distant sound of the saloon on the far end of the street. All of it. The marriage, the confidence scheme, the federal investigation, the way she had not known. She truly had not known. The way the city had looked at her after, the name change, the flight west. She told it flat and plain without any request for sympathy because she could not bear to manipulate him by asking for something she was not sure she deserved. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was thinking rather than judging. "You didn't know," he said. "No, but I should have seen something." People who knew him well have said since that there were signs. People who knew him well say that after, he said. "That's different from knowing it before." "It is," she said, "but that doesn't fully resolve it for me." "No," he said, "I expect not." He put his hat back on. "Does it resolve it for me is the question." She waited. "I think," he said slowly, "that a woman's character is her own, not her husband's." She felt something give way in her chest, something that had been held tight for a very long time. "You should think about it," she said. "It is a complicated thing to attach yourself to." "I'm not easily put off complicated," he said. Then he lifted his hat and said good evening and walked away into the dark, and she went inside and sat on the edge of her narrow bed and cried in a way she had not let herself cry since St. Louis, which was not grief exactly, but something like the body's release of a sustained and particular tension. He came to the boarding house 2 days later and said he had thought about it and he would still like to call on her if she was willing. She was willing. January was the sweetest month she could remember, and she had not expected that of January, which was usually a month of bare endurance. He came twice a week, and they would sit in Mrs. Hartwell's parlor, or walk when the weather permitted, or he would bring her out to the ranch where Samuel Maddox would tell her stories about the early days on the prairie with a nostalgic delight that made him seem 20 years younger than his cough suggested. She and Samuel fell into an easy warmth that was its own separate pleasure, and she suspected Samuel saw in her something that was good for his son, and was doing the quiet, persistent work of a man who approves. She was happy. It was a startling, slightly frightening thing, to be happy. She had not trusted happiness since Clement Vane had bankrupted it for her, and she found herself examining it constantly for flaws, for the hidden thing underneath, for the moment it would turn. It did not turn. Milton Maddox was exactly as he appeared to be, every time, in every weather, patient and steady and quietly, thoroughly present. In February he kissed her for the first time, on the porch of the ranch house, on a day that had surprised everyone by being warm enough for coats rather than heavy wraps. Samuel had gone inside, possibly on purpose. The prairie was pale gold, and the sky was a hard, clean blue, and he kissed her with the same quality as everything else he did, without performance, exactly as much as he meant, and not one particle more. And it was the most straightforwardly devastating experience she had had in years. She rode back to town that evening in a state of something that was half joy and half terror, which was the state she seemed to occupy most consistently whenever she let herself truly feel what she felt about Milton Maddox. This is where the dark past reasserted itself. The letter arrived the first week of March. It was addressed to Esther Vane, which meant someone knew where she was, and it was postmarked St. Louis, and the handwriting on the outside was Clement Vane's. She recognized it with the cold, specific dread of a person who has successfully run from something, and then looked up to find it in the road ahead of them. She sat with the unopened letter for an hour before she opened it. Inside, Clement's handwriting, still infuriatingly elegant, still the handwriting of a man who could make lies look like literature. He had surfaced in New Mexico territory. He had apparently heard through some channel that she was in Hays City. He was writing to ask for money, a modest sum, which would ensure his continued discretion regarding her whereabouts to certain federal parties who were still interested in the case and who might, he suggested, be inclined to look more carefully at the wife's potential involvement if pointed in the right direction. It was blackmail, simple, clean, unambiguous blackmail. She sat with the letter for a very long time. The reasonable thing was to go to Sheriff Cobb. She knew this. Sheriff Cobb was a fair man, and he could contact the federal authorities, and explained the situation, and Clement would be found and dealt with. She had done nothing wrong, and the law would likely bear this out. But likely was not certainly, and the process of bearing things out through federal investigation was a public one, and public meant that everything she had carefully built in Hayes City, every thread of belonging she had woven, would be put in the hands of a process she could not control. And Milton, who had taken the truth about Clement Vane and weighed it and chosen her anyway, would have to watch it become a public spectacle, watch the town talk about it, watch her become again the thing she had been in St. Louis. She could not bear the thought of it. She could not bear the thought of him standing beside that. She made the decision that would haunt her for months. She made it quickly, because she knew if she took longer she would talk herself out of it, and she wrote Clement a short letter telling him she did not have money, but that she would arrange to have some sent to a postal address in Santa Fe within 4 weeks, and then she began to make arrangements to leave Hayes City. It was a cowardly decision, and she knew it the entire time she was making it. She told herself it was protective, that she was protecting Milton and his father and the small, clean life they had, and this was true as far as it went, but it did not go all the way. All the way was the fact that she was afraid of being known in the wrong way, of the horrible vulnerability of being examined in public and found wanting, and this fear had been living in her since St. Louis, and she had never actually resolved it, only outrun it, and now it had caught up and she was doing what she had always done, which was run. She said goodbye to Milton on a Thursday morning in March. She made it brief, which was cruelty of a kind, though she told herself it was mercy. She said she had received news from St. Louis that required her to return. She said it was a family matter. She said she was sorry. He stood with his hat in his hands, which she would later understand was what he did when he was trying very hard not to fall apart, and he looked at her with those gray eyes and he said, "Is there something I can do?" "No," she said. "Is this something you're choosing or something that's happening to you?" She had not expected the question. It was exactly the right question. It cut through everything she was trying to perform and found the actual shape of the thing. "I'm not sure there's a difference," she said. Which was not an answer. She knew it was not an answer. His expression told her he knew it was not an answer. But he was Milton Maddox, and he did not press on things people were not ready to have pressed on, and so he nodded once, and he said he hoped she would be safe, and he watched her get on the stagecoach, and she watched him from the window, standing in the street with his hat in his hands, until the horses carried her away from him and she could not watch him any more. She went back to St. Louis. She did not send Clement money. Instead, she went directly to the federal marshal's office on Chestnut Street, and she told them everything: the blackmail letter, Clement's location in New Mexico, all of it. And she did it with shaking hands and a set jaw, because if she was going to do the right thing, she was going to do it all the way through, and she placed herself entirely at the mercy of the process. The process, as it turned out, was not particularly interested in Esther Vane, now Esther Sutton. The marshals were very interested in Clement Vane's location in New Mexico territory, and they thanked her for the information, and the senior marshal, a thorough man named Porter, looked at her file and told her plainly that there had never been sufficient evidence to implicate her, and that the investigation had moved on from her months ago. She was not a person of interest. She was a witness and a victim of the same fraud as the other families, different only in her proximity to the perpetrator. She sat in the marshal's office and felt something very old and very heavy fall off her shoulders. She went back to the boarding house where she had grown up, which still stood, which was still run by its new proprietress, and she took a room and she lay in the dark and she thought about Milton Maddox standing in the street with his hat in his hands, and she thought about saved places and the people who hold them. She spent 2 weeks in St. Louis resolving what could be resolved. She settled affairs. She wrote to Mrs. Hartwell with an explanation that was more honest than the one she had given Milton, because she owed Mrs. Hartwell that much. She was told in due course by Marshal Porter that Clement Vane had been apprehended near Santa Fe and was in federal custody and would likely not trouble her again. The last thread of the old life was cut. She was free. Entirely, genuinely free. And she had made a terrible mistake. She had stood at the door of something real and good, and she had run from it because she was frightened. And the person she had run from it with, the person who had done nothing but show her patience and truth and quiet, steady regard, deserved a great deal better than the incomplete goodbye she had given him on that Thursday morning in March. The question was whether it was salvageable. The question was whether a man who had been left without adequate explanation, who had watched her get on a stagecoach and disappear from his life, would still want to hear what she had to say. The question was whether he had filled the space she had left with something else, whether he had moved on, as he had every right to do, as she had no standing whatsoever to resent him for doing. She booked her passage back to Hayes City in late September, 8 months after she had left it in the spring. She told herself on the train west that she was going back to explain, to apologize, to close things properly, to give him the real goodbye he deserved. She told herself she was not going back because she still loved him, which was, of course, completely false. She loved him as thoroughly and hopelessly as she ever had. She had loved him every day in St. Louis. She had carried it around like a coal in her chest, warm and occasionally painful. She arrived in Hayes City on a Thursday in October, almost exactly 1 year after she had first arrived in Gus Tolliver's wagon. It was late afternoon, and the light was that particular autumn amber that turns everything it touches into something significant, and the town looked exactly as it had, which was somehow both comforting and devastating. She went to Mrs. Hartwell's, who opened the door and looked at her for a long moment and then said, "Well, come in then," with the economy of a woman who has many thoughts and has chosen the right one. Mrs. Hartwell fed her and asked a few precise questions and listened to the answers with careful attention, and then she said, "He's still there. The ranch. He hasn't gone anywhere." "How is he?" Esther asked. Mrs. Hartwell considered this. "He fixed the Hendersons' fence last month without being asked. He helped the Ferris boys after their father's accident. He brought wood to 3 separate households before the weather turned." She paused. "He is doing the things a man does when he is trying to be useful because usefulness is all he has. So I would say he is not well exactly, but he is holding." Esther heard this and felt it like a physical sensation, like a hand pressed against her sternum. "And Samuel?" she asked. Mrs. Hartwell's face changed. "Samuel passed in July," she said quietly. "His heart." Esther closed her eyes. She had not known. Of course she had not known. She had been in St. Louis and Samuel Maddox had died, and Milton had been alone in that house with the wide porch and Clara Maddox's garden, and no one to tell stories at the dinner table, and she had not been there. "I should go to the ranch," she said. "Yes," said Mrs. Hartwell, "I think you should." She borrowed a horse from the livery, because there was no wagon available and because she did not want to wait for anything, and she rode the 3 miles south of town in the last hour of the amber afternoon light, through the autumn grasses that had gone gold again, through the clear air that carried the smell of turned earth and coming cold, and she told herself to be honest, to be fully and completely honest, which was the only thing she owed him and the only currency that mattered. The ranch looked the same and looked different. The same in its shape, the solid house, the big barn, the creek glinting beyond. Different in some atmospheric way she could not immediately name, and then she recognized it. It was quieter. Samuel's particular energy, that compact and cheerful vitality, was gone from it, and the ranch had contracted slightly around its absence. She knocked on the door. He opened it, and there it was, the moment that had been hurtling toward both of them since the Thursday morning she had gotten on the stagecoach, and the expression on his face when he saw her was not what she had prepared herself for. She had prepared herself for anger or for coldness, or for the particular careful blankness of a person who has decided to feel nothing. She had not prepared herself for what she actually saw, which was something that looked very much like relief. He stepped back to let her in. She stepped inside. He set his hat down on the mantel, then picked it up again, then set it back down, and she realized he was doing the same thing she was, which was trying very hard to hold together under the weight of everything that needed to be said. "I heard about your father," she said. "I am so sorry." "July," he said, peacefully, in his bed. He said this with the steady quality of a man who has been over this particular ground many times and has found his footing on it. And she loved him for it so fiercely, it was nearly painful. "I should have been here," she said. "You didn't know," he said. "No, but if I hadn't left Esther." Her name in his mouth, that particular quiet way he had of saying it, stopped her. "I need to explain," she said, "the real reason I left, all of it." "All right," he said, so she told him. All of it again, the way she had told him about Clement Vane on the porch in December, flat and plain and without ornamentation. The blackmail letter, the decision she had made, the fear underneath the decision. The federal marshal's office in St. Louis and the resolution of the case. Clement in custody, her own absolution by process. And then the harder part, the honest center of it, the part she had not admitted even fully to herself until she was on the train back west. "I was afraid," she said, "not just of what Clement might do or what the town might think. I was afraid of you seeing it, of you being beside it, of the possibility that it would make you regret choosing me, and I could not bear that, and so I left before you had the chance to make that choice, which was wrong. It took the choice away from you entirely, and that was not mine to do." He was quiet for a long moment. "You were protecting me," he said. "Partially," she said. "But I was also protecting myself from something I was afraid of, and I used protecting you as the more acceptable reason. I owe you the truth about that." He looked at her for a long time. Then he crossed the room and he stood in front of the fireplace, and he turned to face her with his hat still in his hands, which she now understood was not a nervous habit but something more deliberate, the way a man holds something when he wants his hands to be honest. "I saved a place for you," he said. The words fell into the room like something that had been waiting to fall for a very long time. She looked at him and felt the full weight of them and said the only question worth asking. "How long?" "Since last winter," he said. "Since last winter. Since March, when she had gotten on the stagecoach and left him standing in the street. He had held a space for her through the spring and the summer, through Samuel's death and July's grief and the long contracted autumn, through all of it. He had held a space for her, simply and without dramatic announcement, the way he did everything." "Milton," she said. "I'm not asking you to apologize more," he said. "I understand why you did what you did. I understand it better than you might think, but I need you to understand something about me." He paused. "I don't make decisions about people lightly. When I decided about you in January after you told me about Vane, I had thought about it carefully and I had decided, and I don't unmake those decisions because a thing gets complicated. Complicated is just the word for things that matter." She felt tears starting, which she had not expected, and she did not try to stop them because she was done with holding things at careful distances. "I came back to explain," she said, "and to apologize, and I told myself that was all. But that was not entirely honest either." "I know," he said. "I came back because I love you," she said. "I have loved you since January, since before January, probably, if I'm being accurate about it. And I was afraid that was too small a reason to ask you to deal with all of it, all the complicated parts, and I was wrong. I should have let you decide." He put his hat on the mantel. He walked across the room toward her, and everything in his face and his bearing was the same as it had always been, patient and honest and without the decorative performance of an emotion he was not feeling. And he stopped in front of her and he put his hands on her face very gently, the way a man holds something he has been careful about for a very long time. "You are here," he said. "I am here," she said. "Then let's start from that," he said. He kissed her with the same quality as he had the first time, on the porch in February with the hard blue winter sky above them, exactly as much as he meant and not one particle more, which was a great deal, as it turned out. She put her hands over his and held them against her face, and felt something settle in her that had not been settled since long before Clement Vane or St. Louis or Hayes City, something that was the feeling of a person who has found the place they were always supposed to be and is, at last, standing in it. They sat by the fire that evening and talked for a long time, filling in the missing months, telling each other the things that had accumulated in the absence. He told her about Samuel's last weeks, which had been peaceful but diminished, and about the burial on the ranch property next to Clara, under the elm trees by the creek, which was what Samuel had asked for. He told it without drama and she listened without platitude, and this too was a kind of intimacy, the ability to sit with a hard thing without trying to fix it. She told him about St. Louis with the full detail she had been unable to give it when she was trying to manage her own fear, and he listened the way he had always listened, with his full attention and without judgment. When she told him about the moment in Marshal Porter's office when she understood that she was genuinely cleared, that the long shadow of Clement Vane was finally and officially lifted, he nodded slowly and said, "Good," with a simplicity that was more generous than any elaborate response could have been. "What do you want now?" he asked when the immediate accumulation of the missing months had been addressed and they were sitting in the comfortable quiet that had always been one of the best things about being near him. "I want to stay," she said, "if that is something you want." "It is," he said without hesitation. "I would need to find work. I cannot simply impose on your household." "Mrs. Hartwell would likely take you back at the boarding house while you settle," he said practically. "The schoolteacher situation has not improved since you left, incidentally. Mr. Addison's filing system was apparently abandoned entirely in your absence, and the county inspector is not pleased." She laughed. It felt like something unlocking. "Is that your way of suggesting I have professional prospects?" "It is my way of suggesting you are useful," he said, with a slight smile that appeared so rarely and so briefly that she had catalogued each one she could remember. "Which you already knew. I think," she said carefully, "that we should do this properly." "I think so too," he said. "I am not in any particular rush," she said, because she felt it was important to say. "I am not asking you to hurry anything. I am simply saying that I want this to be real." "Everything I do is real," he said, in a tone that was so completely devoid of vanity and so absolutely accurate that she had to press her lips together to keep from laughing again. "I know," she said. "I know that is one of the most real things about you." She went back to Mrs. Hartwell's that night, and Mrs. Hartwell asked only one question, which was whether she was staying, and when Esther said yes, Mrs. Hartwell said, "Good," and showed her to her old room, which was, she noticed, exactly as it had been, the same narrow bed, the same window looking out over Delaware Street, as though it had been waiting. The autumn progressed, and it was different from the first autumn in every way that mattered because she was no longer a woman performing a careful, watchful version of herself, but a woman who had been known in the hardest way, and had found that she was not destroyed by it. She took back her position helping at the schoolhouse and spent 3 days reconstructing Mr. Addison's filing system, with the brisk efficiency of someone who has solved this problem before and has no patience for it. She resumed her place in the social fabric of the town, which received her return with the matter-of-fact warmth that Hayes City was capable of when it chose to be, less interest in the complicated parts of her absence and more pleasure in her presence. She and Milton fell back into their rhythm, and the rhythm was the same and was different, deeper now, more frank, with the particular ease that comes from having survived the hardest conversation about yourselves and found that you were both still there on the other side of it. He proposed to her in December. He did it on the ranch in the late afternoon in Clara Maddox's garden, which was dormant for the winter but which he had kept immaculate, the beds turned and covered, the borders clear, the small stone path swept. He did it without theatrical artifice, without going down on one knee, because he was not that kind of man and she would not have trusted it if he were. He simply stood in the cold garden with his hands in his coat pockets and said, "I would like you to marry me, Esther. If you are willing." "I am willing," she said immediately. He smiled at her, that rare, brief, complete smile. "Good," he said. She stepped to him, and he put his arms around her, and she leaned against his chest and looked at Clara Maddox's garden and thought about all the gardens that get tended by people who love the person who planted them, and about the particular quality of love that shows itself not in declarations but in the consistent, daily act of maintenance. "Samuel would have been pleased," she said. "He was," Milton said. "He told me so in July. He said he expected you'd come back." She pulled back to look at him. "He said that. He said that woman is not finished here yet. That was the last conversation we had about you." He paused. He was right more often than was comfortable. She pressed her face against his coat and felt the particular warmth of being known by people who are gone and the love they leave behind. They were married in March of 1880 in the small church on the east side of Hay City, on a Saturday when the weather decided to cooperate with an uncharacteristic generosity, and gave them a day that was warm and clear and smelled of the coming spring. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Mr. Collins, who was brief and sincere, which suited them both. Mrs. Hartwell was there, beaming with the particular satisfaction of a woman whose instincts have been vindicated. Sheriff Cobb was there, Bill Ferris and his family, the Hendersons and the Addisons and the better part of the town, which had been quietly invested in this outcome for some time. Esther wore the dark green wool dress because it was the best dress she had, and because it was the dress she had worn to the Ferris Christmas gathering in 1878, the first night he had come for her properly, and because she had a feeling that this detail would matter to her when she looked back on it. Milton wore his good jacket and his best hat and looked at her when she walked into the church with an expression she had never seen on him before, open and uncomplicated and luminous, and she thought that this was the true version of his face that she would carry for the rest of her life, the one beneath the patient steadiness, the one that was saved for occasions of great consequence. They moved her belongings from the boarding house to the ranch that same afternoon, which was practical and also, she felt, exactly the right way to do it, without ceremony or delay, because they were both people who believed in beginning a thing when you meant to begin it. The ranch became her home in the full sense, not the careful guest sense in which she had visited it before. She learned its rhythms and its demands, and she was good at them, which she had suspected she would be, because the skills that had served her at the boarding house, the practical intelligence, the attention to detail, the ability to manage complex systems efficiently, translated naturally to the management of a working ranch. She was not a woman who stood back and watched. She was a woman who got into the work. The spring was full and busy with the usual demands of the season, calving and planting and fence repair, and the 100 other imperatives of a working ranch in April and May. She and Milton worked side by side through most of it, and she found this to be one of the best and most specific pleasures of her new life, the plain animal satisfaction of shared work, of being useful together in a practical, daily way. She wrote to the federal marshal's office in early April to confirm that Clement Vane had been tried and convicted and was serving his sentence in a federal penitentiary in Missouri. The reply came in May and confirmed all of it. She read the letter once and then folded it carefully and put it in the small box where she kept important documents, and she thought, with a clean and final clarity, that it was done. She told Milton that evening. He nodded and said, "Good," the same word he always used for things that resolved as they should, and then he continued reading the seed catalog he had been working through, and she sat across from him at the kitchen table and thought about how freedom can look like nothing more than a man reading a catalog in lamplight, and how this is possibly the best version of it. They were well together, which is the particular blessing that is harder to describe than the dramatic versions of love but is so much better to live. They did not agree on everything. She was, as it turned out, more inclined than he was to take risks, particularly financial ones, and she pushed him more than once toward investments in the ranch that he would not have made on his own. He was, in turn, more patient than she was, with people and with weather and with the slow administrative processes of county government, and there were times when his patience irritated her and times when it saved her from herself. They argued occasionally, with the directness of two people who did not see the point of being indirect, and they resolved their arguments with the same directness, which was efficient if occasionally exhausting. In August, she realized she was pregnant. She told him on a Sunday morning on the porch of the ranch house, with the summer prairie spread wide and golden in every direction, and the sound of the creek faint and pleasant in the distance. She told him matter-of-factly, because she was not a woman who could perform elaborate revelations, and she watched his face with a slight anxiety she had not fully admitted to herself. His expression did that thing again, the thing she had only seen at the church in March, open and uncomplicated, and something that was not a word she usually used for him but was suddenly the only accurate word. "Are you well?" he asked first. "I am very well," she said. "Good," he said. Then he reached across and took her hand and held it and looked out at the prairie for a moment, and she watched his face and thought she could see him rearranging the interior of his life to include this, settling the new information into place with the same thorough quality he brought to everything. "Spring," he said, calculating. "March, I think," she said. He nodded. He squeezed her hand once, firmly, and then he stood up and said there was a section of fence in the south pasture that he had been putting off and he thought he would see to it today. And she laughed, because this was exactly how he would process good news that was also enormous news, by putting his hands to practical work, and she loved him for it as she loved him for everything, thoroughly and without reservation. The baby came in April of 1881, 3 weeks after the anniversary of their marriage, which she noted, but did not make anything ornamental of because the circumstances were already entirely sufficient. The labor was long and attended by Mrs. Jenkins, who was the nearest thing Hayes City had to a trained midwife, and who was competent and calm in a way that Esther found enormously steadying. It was a boy, 8 pounds, dark-haired, with eyes the indeterminate blue of all newborns that would eventually, she suspected, settle into gray. Milton held him with the same careful attention he brought to anything fragile and important, the same thoroughness, and he looked at him for a long time without speaking, and when he finally spoke he said, "Samuel," simply, as though he had known it all along. She had thought she might want something different, a name of her own choosing, her father's name, something with her family's history in it, but when he said it she felt instead of argument a slow, warm recognition, because Samuel had been the first person in Hayes City to make her feel known and welcomed, and she had loved him for it. And this seemed right, deeply right. "Samuel," she agreed. And Samuel Maddox II came into the world in the spring of 1881, and was immediately and irreversibly loved by both his parents, who were, it emerged, extremely well suited to parenthood in their different registers. She with the brisk attentiveness of someone who believes in doing things correctly, he with the patient thoroughness of someone who believes in doing things consistently. And between these two approaches the child was comprehensively and very well managed. The ranch grew. Not dramatically, not through any single spectacular event, but through the consistent accumulation of good decisions made by two capable people who trusted each other's judgment. The investment Esther had pushed for in the spring of 1881, a small additional herd of cattle purchased from the Ferris family at a good price, had paid off by fall. The garden, Clara's garden, was no longer just maintained but genuinely tended and expanded, and in the summers it produced with an exuberance that Samuel Maddox the elder would have been very pleased with. Hayes City grew too, settling into a more established version of itself as the frontier pushed further west, and the wildest days of the cattle trade began their slow resolution. The railway brought more families, more commerce, more of the infrastructure of permanent civilization. Sheriff Cobb retired and was replaced by a younger man. Mr. Addison, the schoolteacher, eventually left and was replaced by a woman, Miss Parkins, who was organized and competent and who became a friend of Esther's. The boarding house on Delaware Street passed from Mrs. Hartwell's ownership to her niece, whom Mrs. Hartwell trained with the exacting standards of a woman who believed in doing things correctly. Samuel took his first steps on the ranch porch in September of 1882 and fell immediately, and then stood up and did it again. And his father watched this with an expression that was, by his standards, nearly theatrical in its warmth. In the winter of 1883, when Samuel was a sturdy and extremely opinionated 2-year-old with his grandfather's gray eyes, exactly as she had suspected, Esther realized she was pregnant again. She told Milton the same way she had told him before on the porch on a Sunday morning, matter-of-factly watching his face, the same expression. "Are you well?" he asked first, which she had been waiting for, and this time it made her smile immediately. "Very well," she said. "Good," he said, and this time he did not go immediately to fix a fence. He stayed on the porch with her, and they sat in the winter cold with the prairie before them, watching Samuel attempt to chase the barn cat across the yard with the focused and completely unsuccessful energy of toddlerhood. And they were quiet together in the excellent way, the chosen way, and she thought about last winter, all the last winters, the one in St. Louis when she had been a woman with a blackmail letter and a fear she had not yet named, the one in Hayes City when she had been preparing to leave, and Milton Maddox had been quietly saving her a place without her knowing it. She thought about all the spaces that get held for people, the patient geography of love, the particular faithfulness of a man who says "I decided about you" and means it without condition. The second child arrived in September of 1883, a girl this time, black-haired and loud and immediately certain of her own importance. They named her Clara, which was Milton's suggestion and which required no discussion at all. Clara and Samuel grew up on the ranch together with the particular affinity of children, who are each other's primary companions, close enough in age to be genuine friends, different enough in temperament to be interesting to each other. Samuel was his father's son in his quietness and his thoroughness, the child who sat still long enough to watch a thing fully before touching it. Clara was, as Mrs. Hartwell observed on a visit when the children were 3 and 5 respectively, Esther to the bone, which she meant as the highest possible compliment and which Esther received as such. The years had a texture to them now, full and rich and made of work and season, and the small ceremonies of a life genuinely shared. The spring plantings and the fall harvests, the winter evenings by the fire with Milton reading and the children asleep and the prairie quiet outside. The summer mornings when the light came up gold and early, and the whole ranch smelled of grass and creek water, and she stood on the porch in the good light and felt, as she had first felt it with an alarm she no longer recognized, happy. She was 30 years old in the autumn of 1885, which was 5 years from the autumn she had first come to Hayes City, and she sat with Milton on the porch in the October evening light and told him she had been thinking about this, the 5 years, the accumulation. 5 years, he said. "I arrived in this town on the 3rd of October, 1878, she said. "I remember it very precisely. I had $47.16 and a letter of introduction and a secret I thought was going to prevent me from having any kind of life worth the name. And now," he said, "and now I have a ranch and 2 children and a husband who is an extremely fair farmer and a terrible dancer," she said. "I don't dance at all," he said, which was his way of objecting to the characterization. "Precisely," she said. He made a sound that was very nearly a laugh, which was the best possible version of his relationship to humor. She looked out at the October prairie, the gold grass and the wide sky, and the elm trees by the creek where Samuel and Clara Maddox the elder were buried side by side under the last of the autumn light. She thought about belonging to a place. She thought about the way a place can absorb you and be absorbed by you, the way a ranch and a woman can become genuinely continuous if they are both the right kind. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. "The night you said you had saved a place for me," she said. "The night I came back, when you said it was since last winter," she paused. "I had not allowed myself to believe that. I had decided, very deliberately, that you would have moved on, that you would have been sensible and practical and found some way to fill the space I had left. And when you said you hadn't, when you said it was since last winter, I think that was the single most—" She paused again, searching for the word. "The single most transformative thing that anyone has ever said to me, because it was the thing that made me understand that I was worth being waited for, and I had not believed that before." He was quiet for a moment. "You were worth considerably more than waiting for," he said, "but the waiting part seemed like the least I could do." She turned to look at him. "You knew," she said. "When you said it, you knew what it would mean to me." "I had some idea," he said. She shook her head. "I don't know that I will ever be done being surprised by you," she said. "I hope not," he said, which from any other man would have been a charming line, and from Milton Maddox was a precise and serious statement of preference. The children came barreling around the side of the house at that moment. Samuel at a dignified run, and Clara at the full screaming gallop that was her standard mode of movement through the world. Both of them headed for the porch with the particular urgency of children who have just remembered that supper exists. "Hungry," Samuel reported, with his father's economy of word. "Starving," Clara clarified, with her mother's commitment to specificity. Milton stood and lifted Clara onto his hip in one smooth motion, and she immediately grabbed his hat, which was what she always did, and he allowed this with the resigned patience of a man who has simply decided that his hat belongs partly to his daughter now. Samuel stood beside his father with his hands in his pockets, in an unconscious imitation that Esther noticed every time, and every time it cracked her heart open a little wider. She stood from the porch chair and looked at the four of them in the October light, her family, her ranch, the garden visible at the corner of the house, the elm trees by the creek, the whole uncomplicated, beautiful fact of the life she had built from $47.16 and a willingness to eventually stop running. She had been afraid for so long of being known in the wrong way. She had carried her dark past like a stone, and she had run from it, and it had caught up with her. And when it finally did, when she was finally fully known, the thing she had feared most, being abandoned by the person whose regard she could not bear to lose, had turned out not to be a thing she ever needed to fear from Milton Maddox, who had made a decision and had no intention of unmaking it. She went inside and started supper, and Milton set Clara down in the kitchen and went to wash up, and Samuel sat at the table and watched her cook with his grave, attentive face, and offered a running commentary on the process that was so precisely calibrated toward the helpful that it was impossible to be annoyed by it, which was perhaps the most accurate possible description of what it was like to be his parent. Later, after supper and after the children were in bed, she and Milton sat by the fire with their usual evening quiet, and he was reading and she was mending a shirt of Samuel's that had gone irreparably optimistic about the durability of its elbow. And the fire was warm, and the prairie was dark and still outside, and the house held around them all the steady, ordinary sacredness of a life lived in full. She looked at him across the firelight and thought about the man he was, this specific, particular man who turned hat brims in his hands when he was trying not to fall apart, who kept his mother's garden without knowing whether it helped, who argued about fence wire in the mercantile with quiet absolute certainty, who saved places for people since last winter and did not make an announcement of it. She thought about how you can build a whole life on a foundation of someone else's faithfulness without fully understanding what you have been given, until you are old enough to see it from a distance. She was not yet old enough to see it from a great distance. She was 30 years old, and she had decades ahead of her in this house with this man on this land, and the future extended before her the way the Kansas prairie extended before the ranch house, wide and workable and lit in all seasons by a sky large enough to contain everything. "Milton," she said. He looked up from his book. "I love you," she said, which she said to him frequently and which she meant every single time with the full unadorned weight of it. "I know," he said, and went back to his book, which was, in the particular grammar of Milton Maddox, the truest and most intimate response he could have given, the response of a man who does not need to perform his certainty, because his certainty is not a performance. She smiled at her mending and said nothing further, and the fire burned down, and the night settled over the Kansas prairie, over Hays City and its boarding houses and its mercantile and its church, and the people moving through their various lives, over the Maddox Ranch with its wide porch and its creek, and the 2 old graves under the elm trees, and the 2 young children asleep in the rooms upstairs, over all the space that had been saved, and the people who had finally come to stand in it. Spring arrived the following year with a warmth that felt like a gift, and she found herself pregnant a 3rd time, which she had not planned for precisely but was not surprised by either. And when she told Milton on the porch on the Sunday morning, he said, "Are you well?" first, and she said, "Very well," and he said, "Good," and then he said, "3 is a number Clara will have very strong opinions about," which was the wittiest thing she had ever heard him say, and she laughed until her eyes watered. The 3rd child was another boy, born in November, whom they named Daniel after her father, which had been waiting its proper turn, and Milton had said yes to this name with the same simplicity he brought to all good things. Daniel was quieter than Clara and louder than Samuel and entirely himself from the first moment, which seemed to be the way with children, each one arriving as the person they already essentially were. The ranch continued to grow, slowly, honestly, the way real things grow. By 1887, they had doubled the herd from its original size, and had added a small apple orchard on the south side of the property that had been Esther's idea, and that was beginning to bear fruit in the literal sense with a satisfying reliability. The orchard had been a risk, and Milton had been patient about the risk, which was the standard working relationship between them, and when the first proper harvest came in the autumn of 1887, he had looked at the trees heavy with fruit in the September afternoon and said nothing, but he had taken her hand and held it, which was entirely sufficient. The children grew. The land was worked. The seasons turned. Hays City grew into a town that would eventually grow into a city, though neither of them would live to see the full extent of that transformation, and the wild days of the frontier became the subject of stories rather than the subject of daily life, which is the way it always goes. In the evenings, sometimes, she would stand on the porch and look west where the light stayed longest on the horizon, that thin gold line that the dark comes up to meet, and she would think about the woman she had been on Gus Tolliver's wagon, frightened and determined, and full of secrets, looking at that same horizon, and believing that a new country could make her into a new person. She had not become a new person. She had become, at last, fully the person she had always been, which is an entirely different thing and considerably harder to do. The secrets were gone. The dark past had been resolved in a federal marshal's office in St. Louis and in a December conversation on a porch and in every day since. The fear that had been her oldest companion, the fear of being known completely and found insufficient, had been answered on the night she had come back to this ranch with her carpetbag and her honesty, and found that the space was still there, still held, patient and certain as the man who had kept it. She had been found sufficient. Not despite everything, but with everything, the whole complicated account of herself, Esther Vane and Esther Sutton and Esther Maddox, and the woman underneath all the names who had needed, more than anything, someone who would decide about her and not unmake the decision. Milton came out onto the porch behind her one September evening in 1888, when she had been standing at the railing watching the last light over the prairie and thinking these thoughts, which were becoming more frequent as she approached 33, and the luxury of retrospect became available. He stood beside her at the railing and they looked at the horizon together. "Happy," he said. It was a word he almost never used, not because he was against happiness, but because he was, by nature and inclination, a man more oriented toward the practical and the immediate than the evaluative. That he asked it meant he had been thinking about it. She turned to look at him. That face, shaped by the land and the seasons and the 38 years of being exactly and consistently himself. The gray eyes that held the light a beat longer than seemed natural, the jaw she had memorized, and the hands that were capable and plain and always honest about what they were doing. "Profoundly," she said. He nodded once, satisfied, the way he was satisfied by things that confirmed what he had already known. He took her hand the way he had taken it in the orchard, firmly and without performance, and they stood together at the railing of the wide porch of the Maddox ranch, while the September light went golden, and then amber, and then gave way at last to the first stars over the Kansas plain. And inside the house behind them, Samuel was doing his lessons at the kitchen table, and Clara was interrogating Daniel about something he had done wrong in the barn, and Daniel was maintaining a dignified silence on the subject, and the creek ran clear behind the elm trees, and the garden stood at its September best, and all of it was real and present and theirs, every inch of it earned and chosen and loved. She leaned against his shoulder. He was solid and warm and absolutely there. She thought about last winter, all the last winters, and the place that had been saved, and the long road she had traveled to come to stand in it. She thought that some things you cannot plan for and cannot arrange, some things you can only, in the end, have the courage to return to. She had returned, and the space had been waiting, and everything that needed to be true was true. The last of the light went from the horizon, and the stars took the full dark Kansas sky, and the evening wind moved through the tall grasses of the prairie. And on the porch of the Maddox ranch, Esther Maddox, who had once been Esther Sutton, who had once been Esther Vane, who was and would always be simply and completely herself, stood with her husband in the dark and breathed and was, in every room of her heart, entirely and finally home.